fine dining with the world's premier wines, beauteous decor of the grandest estates, maybe a day out yacht racing or horse riding with the nobility, and apparently an orgy. The Victorian era announced itself to the world with its pristine puritanical standards and rigid social etiquette. Though at the exact same time, Victorian society was exploring all things sexual, depraved, excessive, and raunchy. As the world saw a standard of purity and sexual repression, the streets of London were homes of S&M dungeons and underground erotic literature. As the world looked on at the feudal nobility of the British Empire, country estates were home to affairs, promiscuity, and sexual proclivity. Welcome to History on Fleek. Today we examine the underground society of the Victorian Elite and their salacious, nasty parties. The subcultures aside, the Victorian elite were afforded the most lavish of lifestyles. Commonly found were luxury homes and extensive servant staff catering to all their needs. The fittings of the homes themselves were displays of opulence and the Victorian appreciation of it, be it the grandest furniture, the highest ceilings, ornate decor, or the most expensive of threads and garbs. Victorian standards were high, but only to a point, about as luxurious as one could possibly be without going any further. If you will, walking on a tightrope between lavish and excessive. Take their dining, for example. The elite of Victorian England was notorious for decadent and elaborate dining habits. Courses would be endless, and the wines served were only the finest. Mwah! Usually following a midday soiree of an extravagant dining occasion, the Victorian elite would be found hunting, horseback riding, and even yacht racing for leisure. With all this, you have to ask, did you need kinky subcultures? Are you sure? Considering the Victorian era's reputation for stiff-lipped, button-down formality and manners, the area had an underbelly of some magnitude. Upper-class men of Victorian England had a flip side to their entire presentation. In the mold of explorer and writer Richard Francis Burton, upper-class men of the time seemingly had quite the appetite for exploring sexual practices. To be perfectly frank, Victorian England's underbelly was the foundation of BDSM to this very day. How this came to be is a fascinating insight into psychosexual phenomena. The education system that Victorian men had come through was single-sex, and the only women they would come across in this system were disciplinarians. This shouldn't come as a surprise, but the education systems of yesteryear were pretty heavy on corporal punishment. Roll on a few years and erotic literature found an entire subgenre dedicated to boys having their sexual awakenings amid a thrashing from a governess. Roll on a few more years when such boys had become men, entire sections of 19th century London were renowned for their dungeons, regularly frequented with upper-class men demanding to be flogged. You better believe it, until the 1960s the term dominatrix didn't exist. Until then, they were known as governesses. The Souls were perhaps the height of the elite Victorian party scene. A closed circle of wits, aristocratic artists, and politicians in the late 19th century England. The Souls were something of a very exclusive and private party unto themselves. Some of the most renowned names of the time were Souls, or at least rubbing shoulders with them. Violent Granby, the Duchess of Rutland, Baroness Etty Grenfell, one-time Viceroy of India and statesman George Curzon, Conservative cabinet member George Wyndham, and if rumor is to be believed, Oscar Wilde and H.G. Wells. Amazingly, the Souls were helmed by Margot Tennant, soon-to-be wife of Prime Minister H.H. Asquith, and future Prime Minister Arthur Balfour. Such esteemed figures would meet in the grandest country houses. While upper-class entertainment was littered with formality and prone to rituals of gambling and racing, the Souls had other ideas. The Souls' idea of a fun social scene was conversation and erudite games. Yet, what started with talk, play, and flirting would develop into something rather different. Little did they advertise it as part of their day-to-day lives, but Victorian England brought forth a roaring pornography trade. Approaching the middle of the 19th century, Holywell Street in London was home to some 57 porn shops. The Times would comment that this was the most vile street in the civilized world. Come the 1830s, writers of the time would comment how on any day, men and women could be found hovering around the street, gleaning into shop windows for a look and obscene engravings and publications found inside. Typically, newspapers of the time would lambast the weaker sex for having a peek on Honeywell Street, whilst having nothing to say of the men doing the very same thing. Evidently, the mishmash of outward purity and private proclivity clashing had the establishment somewhat frightened. In 1857, the Obscene Publications Act was passed to rid the streets of England of sites such as Holywell Street. It didn't work, though. The illicit publications simply moved further underground, with booksellers taking up pseudonyms to avoid the wrath of the law. Some 30 years later, the Autobiography of a Flea was released in 1887, a truly scuzzy tale of a flea that witnessed the exploitation and seduction of a girl called Bella. Oh yes, the rather pure Victorians were all eyes on matters debauched. To quote Victorian stalwart Aunt Epps, sex is like bread. What would life be without it? A dull business indeed. Once doors were closed and discretion was assured, some elites of the Victorian era would engage in behavior well below the projected moral standard of the time. Most of their activity was more or less taboo by Victorian standards, morally reprehensible even. If you could be a fly on the wall in the late 19th century, you would likely be privy to an extensive gambling scene. The more wealthy the participants, the more high stakes the betting and games would be. For clarity, the gambling would have been highly illegal. More patently, in the face of moral standards, substance abuse was a given at a nasty party. While excessive drinking was highly frowned upon, yeah, in Britain, can you believe that? Alcohol and even opium in abundance could be found. Yet, as was a theme throughout Victorian society counterculture, sexual debauchery was the flavor of the day. Orgies, promiscuity, affairs, and forays into BDSM and sadomasochism were all on the menu of Victorian nasty parties. While elite, exclusive, and robustly private, the souls, as it turns out, were evidently human. Rather than meeting and indulging in all the finery afforded to upper-class Victorians, they went their own way. Wouldn't you know it, instead of dining and orchestrated leisure activities, sitting around, deeply talking and flirting had consequences. The souls were alleged to have a courtly code of their own for married members. Every woman shall have her man, but no man shall have his woman. This didn't exactly hold up. The married members of the souls took lovers and would go on to secretly bear their children. In this obtuse, self-policing society, adulterous affairs were the norm, but their code would not go unbroken. Harry Cust, a politician and member of Parliament, was a member of the souls and an unmarried man. Reportedly something of a lady killer, the handsome Harry was pursued by women, many older and unhappily wed in marriages arranged by their parents. Harry, by all accounts, was not one to resist advances. Matters would come to a head when Harry Cust would begin an affair with Nina Welby Gregory. Ever the womanizer, Harry was in love and talking about marriage to another woman at the time, Pamela Wyndham. But all was derailed with Nina revealing she was pregnant. As a member of Parliament, the scandal was a highly public matter. As for the souls, their world was left shattered. Seducing a single woman of the same class profoundly broke their private code and rules. Harry and Nina would spend their lives rebuilding their reputations and dealing with the marriage they had no choice but to enter. The band of private posh renegades known as the Souls would disband within 15 years of their founding. Conversely, the Victorian elite was still subject to social standards, considering they had an open playground of leisure at their private disposal. Victorians had a remarkably strict social code, and the elite wasn't exempt. They could not engage in premarital sex, and they would be expected to not be found drinking in excess. As you can see, lavish, but not excessive, luxurious, but not bawdy. Yet, this was far from the only awkward hypocrisy that the Victorian elite was guilty of. For an era that was nearly propped up on child labor, had you asked an upper-class Victorian, you'd think it wasn't even happening. The same could be said for the working class. Their grim suffering and conditions were not worthy of mention for the elite of the country, though they were likely well aware. Last but not least, we're talking about England, Britain, the Empire. This time in British history was a time of clear domination and expanse of the empire and the subjugation of its colonies. How much the profit of other countries' labor was enjoyed by these Victorian elites, much like child labor and the working class sufferance, was no doubt lost on them. This is History on Fleek, and we'll see you next time.